Human history is not a straight road rising steadily from darkness into knowledge. Again and again, societies grew, organized the world around them, and then disappeared, taking languages, skills, memories, and ways of living that evolution could not easily replace. Yet some things crossed every collapse without needing libraries, rulers, or written records. They survived inside ordinary hands, bodies, habits, and fears. If we are the seventh civilization, what survived every reset and is still here now? When people imagine the fall of a civilization, they often picture a single night in which the lights go out, the streets empty, and an entire world disappears. Real history is usually slower, less complete, and more uneven. A palace may burn while nearby farms continue producing food. A government may lose control while families remain in the same houses. Trade routes may weaken, taxes may stop being collected, and official records may become rare, yet people still wake, cook, repair tools, care for children, bury the dead, and remember where water can be found. What disappears first is often not human life itself, but coordination on a large scale. The systems that connect distant regions begin to fail. Messages arrive late or not at all. Roads become harder to maintain. Specialists who depended on steady supplies can no longer work in the same way. A city may shrink because grain no longer reaches it regularly, but the people who leave do not vanish. They move into smaller settlements, return to farming, join relatives elsewhere, or adapt their skills to a different economy. Archaeology often reveals this transition not as a clean break, but as a change in patterns. Imported objects become less common. Buildings are repaired with simpler materials. Monumental construction stops. Written administration declines. Pottery styles change. Burials shift location. These signs can show that an old political order has weakened, but they do not mean that every habit, language, belief, or skill disappeared with it. The beginning of humanity was never tied to cities. Long before walls, temples, and written laws, human groups survived through memory, cooperation, movement, and practical knowledge carried from one generation to the next. Those older forms of continuity did not become useless when civilization appeared. They remained underneath it, ready to support life when larger systems became unstable. This is why the idea of a reset must be handled carefully. A reset is rarely a return to nothing. It is more often a reduction in complexity, a loss of connections, and a rearrangement of daily life. Some knowledge can disappear when too few people understand it. Some techniques survive because they are practiced every day. Some institutions collapse because they require armies, taxes, archives, or long-distance supply. Other customs endure because they require only a household, a village, a spoken memory, or a pair of trained hands. Even when rulers are forgotten, people may continue planting familiar crops, building with local materials, following seasonal paths, and teaching children how to behave among relatives and strangers. The cold fact is that history preserves stone more easily than ordinary life. Ruined walls remain visible, while gestures, habits, and spoken instructions leave faint traces. This can make collapse look more total than it was. We see the abandoned center, but not every small community that continued beyond it. We find broken monuments, but not the full chain of meals, repairs, births, illnesses, and decisions that, if we are asking what survived repeated resets, we must first stop looking only for things large enough to become ruins. The most durable inheritance may have traveled quietly through bodies, families, tools, and routines that never needed to be carved into stone. Population decline can deepen this process without erasing everyone. Disease, conflict, drought, migration, and political disorder may combine differently in different places, leaving some districts nearly empty while others remain active. Later generations may reuse old walls without understanding their original purpose, or preserve a method after its former name has been lost. Continuity does not require perfect memory. It requires enough people to carry useful knowledge into new conditions. What survives, therefore, is filtered by necessity, repetition, access to materials, and the shared ability to teach. A civilization can end as a political system while much of its human world continues in altered form, and that distinction changes the question before us. The phrase, seventh civilization, can be useful, but only if it is treated as a way of asking a question rather than as a proven count of human history. Archaeology does not show that the whole planet passed through 6 earlier global civilizations, each rising, collapsing, and being replaced in a neat sequence. Instead, complex societies appeared at different times in different regions. Cities developed in Mesopotamia, the Nile Valley, the Indus region, northern China, Mesoamerica, the Andes, and other places through combinations of farming, trade, political authority, environment, and tradition. Some flourished while others were only beginning. Some declined while distant societies expanded. There was no single clock controlling them all. Even the word civilization can hide more than it reveals, because scholars use it to describe many kinds of social complexity, and those societies did not all share the same institutions, values, technologies, or paths of change. A city with writing and centralized rule is easy to recognize, but human communities also created systems without leaving the same kinds of monuments or records. The beginning of our species was not divided into numbered worlds. For most of human existence, people lived in small, mobile, or seasonally settled groups whose lives cannot be reduced to an empty stage before civilization. They carried knowledge of landscapes, animals, plants, kinship, tools, fire, weather, and cooperation. Those forms of knowledge were already old by the time the first cities appeared. When later states rose and fell, they did not replace the foundations beneath them, they built upon them. This matters because a numbered title can easily become a false historical claim if it is taken literally. There is no accepted archaeological evidence for 6 technologically advanced global societies erased before the present one, and no sequence of worldwide resets that returned all humanity to the same starting point. Catastrophes did occur. Climates shifted, populations moved, political systems fragmented, epidemics, droughts, warfare, trade disruption, and environmental pressure sometimes contributed to severe regional decline. Yet these events did not affect every place in the same way or at the same time. A collapse in one region could coincide with stability or growth elsewhere. Knowledge lost in one community might remain common in another. People could abandon an urban center while preserving language, crops, craft traditions, family ties, and religious practices in new settlements. The image of a total reset is therefore less accurate than the image of many overlapping interruptions. Human history resembles a landscape of rivers rather than a staircase. Channels divide, disappear underground, merge again, or change direction, but water continues to move through the terrain. In the same way, cultures borrow, adapt, forget, preserve, and recombine. A tool may survive while its original meaning changes. A crop may travel beyond the society that first cultivated it. A story may be reshaped until its earliest form is no longer recoverable. A building method may continue because it suits local materials, not because anyone remembers its first inventor. Calling the present world the 7th civilization can still serve a purpose if it reminds us that no social order is permanent. It can direct attention toward the fragile systems supporting modern life and toward the older capacities that do not depend entirely on those systems. But honesty requires a boundary between metaphor and evidence. The central question is not whether 6 hidden worlds existed exactly as imagined. It is whether repeated regional collapses reveal a pattern in what humans tend to lose, what they manage to preserve, and what can be rebuilt because it remains embedded in bodies, relationships, and daily practice. Once the number is released from literal history, the deeper inquiry becomes clearer. We are not searching for a secret succession of vanished global empires. We are tracing the quieter inheritance that moved through many societies, survived different kinds of disruption, and reached the present without ever belonging to only one civilization. If collapse is rarely complete, and if the phrase 7th civilization is a metaphor rather than an archaeological count, then the useful question begins somewhere quieter. It does not begin with a search for a lost empire larger than any we know. It begins with the ordinary things that remain possible after palaces fall, archives burn, roads decay, and distant authorities stop answering. A society may lose its rulers and still retain farmers who understand local soil. It may lose formal schools and still retain adults who can teach by demonstration. It may lose written instructions and still preserve the movements required to shape wood, prepare food, carry water, calm a child, or recognize the approach of cold weather. These continuities are less dramatic than ruined towers, but they are often more important to survival. The earliest human communities depended on them long before cities existed. Cooperation, observation, memory, imitation, and care were not inventions of states. They were older capacities through which people learned to live in changing environments and to pass useful knowledge across generations. When complex institutions later appeared, they expanded what human groups could coordinate, but they did not replace these foundations. They rested upon them. This shifts the meaning of what survives. Survival does not require an object to remain unchanged for thousands of years. It may mean that a practical principle continues while its material form changes. A stone blade and a steel knife are not the same tool, yet both depend on an understanding of edges, pressure, and controlled cutting. A spoken warning and a written notice are not the same medium, yet both allow one person's knowledge to protect another. A household fire and an electric stove are different technologies, yet both organize heat around the preparation of food. Continuity can therefore hide inside transformation. The outer form changes, while a deeper human need remains. Archaeology can sometimes follow this process through tools, food remains, buildings, paths, and patterns of settlement. It can show that people reused places, adapted old methods, or combined inherited practices with new materials. But many forms of continuity leave only partial traces. Gestures vanish. Voices vanish. Most daily decisions are never recorded. A child watching an adult repair a basket may become part of a chain of knowledge that no monument identifies. A family moving away from a failing town may carry seeds, recipes, stories, and habits into another region, even if their names disappear from history. This is why the question should not be limited to what remains standing. Stone favors the visible. Human continuity often survives through repetition. What is practiced frequently is easier to preserve than what depends on rare specialists or distant supply. What can be taught face to face may endure when institutions weaken. What uses local materials may outlast systems that require resources from far away. None of this means that loss is small. Collapses can destroy lives, erase languages, break communities, and remove knowledge that may never return. The point is not to make decline seem gentle. It is to separate total disappearance from uneven survival. Once that distinction is clear, the title becomes less a claim about numbered civilizations and more an investigation into durable human capacities. The evidence points us away from a hidden master blueprint and toward many modest inheritances. The ability to cooperate, to care, to use fire, to make tools, to remember roots, to prepare food, to tell stories, and to teach. There, survival began as learned behavior carried between vulnerable human beings. These abilities do not guarantee that any society will endure. They do explain why human life can continue after a particular social order ends. The search should therefore move away from counting vanished worlds. It should instead examine the oldest archive we still possess, the living human body, and ask what history placed inside it before the first city was ever built. Before any city raised walls or any ruler counted grain, the human body already carried a collection of abilities shaped through a very long history. People could walk across difficult ground, balance on uneven surfaces, recognize familiar faces, notice changes in weather, judge the mood of another person, and learn by watching. None of these capacities required writing, formal schools, or permanent buildings. They belonged to bodies living among other bodies, exposed to hunger, cold, injury, uncertainty, and the constant need to cooperate. Human beings did not survive because each individual possessed everything needed for life. They survived because perception, movement, memory, and social attention worked together inside groups. A person who noticed tracks might help others find animals or avoid danger. Someone who remembered a water source could guide the group during a dry period. An adult who understood how to calm a frightened child protected more than one life. Because human children depend on care for an unusually long time, these abilities were never simple decorations added after civilization began. They formed the ground upon which later societies were built. Long-distance walking offers one clear example. The human body is not the fastest in nature, yet it can move steadily across varied terrain, regulate heat through sweating, and carry food, tools, or infants over distance. The precise ways early populations used these traits differed across environments, and archaeology cannot reconstruct every daily journey. Still, the broad importance of mobility is well supported. Human groups moved through grasslands, forests, coasts, river valleys, and colder regions, adapting their routes to seasons and resources. Their feet, hips, spine, lungs, and sense of balance made movement possible, but movement also depended on shared knowledge. A path existed not only on the ground but in memory. Face recognition and social awareness were equally old forms of survival. Humans are highly sensitive to gaze, expression, voice, posture, and signs of familiarity. These signals help people distinguish relatives, companions, strangers, anger, fear, attention, and trust. No single expression has exactly the same meaning in every culture, and we should not imagine the inner thoughts of prehistoric people. Yet the human nervous system clearly developed within deeply social conditions. Living with others required continual interpretation. Cooperation could bring food, protection, shared care, and knowledge, while conflict or exclusion could carry serious costs. The body therefore became an instrument for reading both landscape and community. The hand added another layer. A human hand can grip firmly, pinch delicately, rotate objects, and adjust pressure with remarkable precision. These movements allowed tools to become increasingly varied, but the deeper inheritance was not any single object. It was the capacity to connect sight, touch, memory, and imitation. One person could watch another strike stone, twist fiber, scrape wood, or prepare food, then repeat the motion and improve through practice. Knowledge entered muscle and habit before it entered books. Even rest had ancient biological foundations. The body learned rhythms of waking, fatigue, darkness, warmth, social safety, and alertness long before artificial clocks divided the day. Modern life changes these conditions, but it does not erase the older nervous system beneath them. The beginning of humanity remains present in the way attention shifts towards sudden sound, in the comfort of familiar voices, in the need for sleep, and in the quiet coordination of hands and eyes. Civilizations later surrounded these capacities with institutions, machines, and rules. Yet when large systems weaken, people still return to the abilities carried closest to them. These ordinary functions can persist through migration, political decline, and changing technology because every generation encounters them through bodies. They may be trained differently, valued differently, or supported by different tools, but they do not need an empire to be rediscovered. Their continuity begins again with each child. The oldest surviving archive is not hidden beneath stone. It is active whenever a person walks, watches, remembers, teaches, carries, recognizes, or cares. The human body carries ancient capacities into surroundings that changed far more quickly than biology could fully follow. Cities, engines, electric light, processed food, climate control, and digital communication have transformed daily life within a small fraction of the time through which the human nervous system took shape. This does not mean the body is defective or frozen in the past. Human beings are flexible, and culture allows rapid adaptation. Yet, flexibility has limits. A body formed for movement, changing daylight, varied temperatures, close social contact, and uncertain access to food now often spends long hours seated, indoors, awake after darkness, and surrounded by signals that demand attention without requiring physical action. The contrast helps explain why some modern comforts can exist beside persistent unease. Ancient humans did not live in one universal environment, and their lives should not be romanticized. They faced injury, disease, hunger, exposure, and dangers that modern systems often reduce. Still, across many environments, survival required regular movement and direct engagement with the physical world. Muscles, bones, balance, circulation, and attention worked together while people walked, carried, climbed, gathered, built, and watched. Modern tools can remove much of that effort, which saves time and prevents harm, but they also reduce the daily use of systems that remain biologically active. A chair does not injure civilization, and artificial light is not an enemy. The deeper issue is that the body still responds to duration, repetition, and rhythm. It notices how long it remains still, when light reaches the eyes, whether sleep arrives regularly, and whether social contact feels present or distant. Food reveals another mismatch. For most of human history, energy-rich foods were valuable because they were not always available. Preferences for sweetness, fat, and salt developed within environments where obtaining calories required effort and where scarcity was common. Modern production can deliver concentrated energy continuously, separating appetite from the conditions in which it evolved. This does not reduce eating to a simple failure of will. It shows how an inherited system can meet an environment unlike the one that shaped it. Similar tensions appear in attention. Sudden movement, alarming sounds, signs of social judgment, and uncertain threats naturally draw awareness. In older settings, rapid attention could help a person respond to danger or opportunity. Modern communication can present such signals repeatedly, even when the body cannot act on them. The nervous system may remain alert while the person stays physically still, receiving distant emergencies, arguments, and demands through a small screen. The beginning of humanity is therefore not behind us in a vanished landscape. It continues in the pulse that quickens at uncertainty, the eyes that follow motion, the shoulders that tighten under unresolved threat, and the relief produced by a familiar voice. None of these reactions proves that prehistoric people felt exactly as we do, because culture and circumstance shape experience. They do show that modern life operates through an organism much older than its surroundings. Civilization survives by building systems around this organism, but it can also forget what the organism requires. When large systems weaken, the body does not return to a pure ancestral state. It carries the effects of upbringing, work, diet, illness, technology, and personal history. Even so, its basic needs for rest, movement, nourishment, temperature regulation, safety, and human connection remain. These needs crossed political borders and historical collapses because they were never stored in one archive. They were renewed through birth in every generation. What survived each disruption was not a perfect memory of earlier life, but a biological framework capable of learning again. Its quiet discomforts can remind us that progress changes surroundings more rapidly than it changes the body within them. The modern body is therefore neither an untouched relic, nor a machine designed for the present. It is a living compromise between inherited structures and rapidly changing conditions, carrying ancient sensitivities beneath every layer of civilization. If complex technology disappeared, the first loss would not be the human ability to act, but the systems that extend it. Machines multiply strength, preserve information, move goods, control temperature, and connect distant people. Without them, life would become harder, slower, and more local. Yet the body would still arrive with tools older than any machine. Hands could still grasp, lift, twist, scrape, bind, carry, and shape. Eyes could still compare distance, motion, color, and form. Ears could still separate familiar sounds from unusual ones. The nervous system could still learn through repetition, correction, and attention. These abilities would not recreate modern industry, and they should not be treated as proof that collapse would be easy. They would simply form the starting point from which adaptation could begin. A human hand is especially important because it does not perform only one task. Its strength can hold an object, while its finer movements can guide a thread, turn a tool, or test the surface of stone and wood. The hand works with the eyes, shoulders, memory, and posture, creating a flexible system rather than a single instrument. Technology has always depended on that system. Even the most advanced machine must first be imagined, assembled, maintained, or directed through human perception and learned movement. If a device fails, the possibility of repair begins with someone noticing what has changed. Observation comes before correction. At the beginning of humanity, knowledge did not wait inside manuals. It moved between people through watching, copying, practice, and attention. A learner saw how pressure was applied, how material responded, and how an error was adjusted. Much of this process remains present today. A written explanation can help, but many skills become reliable only when the body repeats them. Balance, timing, force, and touch are difficult to store completely in words. They survive through use. This is why practical knowledge may continue even when names, theories, or institutions are lost. A person may no longer know who first developed a method, yet still know how to perform it. The body can preserve a pattern without preserving its history. Learning also allows humans to use unfamiliar materials. People are not born knowing how to make a shelter, prepare every plant, or shape every tool. They are born with capacities that make teaching and adaptation possible. Attention can be directed, mistakes can be remembered, movements can be refined. Other people can demonstrate alternatives. This flexibility is one of the oldest inheritances carried beneath civilization. It does not guarantee correct choices, because knowledge can be incomplete, local conditions can be misunderstood, and groups can lose essential skills. Still, it allows behavior to be rebuilt from observation and cooperation. The origins of human survival were never contained in muscle alone. A strong individual without shared knowledge would remain limited. Hands become more capable when communities preserve methods, divide work, and teach younger members. The same is true of memory. One person may remember a route, another a season, another a material, and another a technique. Together, they hold more than any isolated body could carry. When large systems disappear, this distributed knowledge becomes fragile, but it can also become the bridge between loss and continuity. What survives every reset is therefore not a hidden collection of perfect instructions. It is the human capacity to notice, imitate, practice, cooperate, and begin again with whatever remains nearby. The body is not a complete civilization in miniature. It cannot replace farms, medicine, sanitation, transport, or stored scientific knowledge. But it is the living platform on which all of those achievements were built. Beneath every tool lies a hand that learned control. Beneath every route lies a body that learned distance. Beneath every archive lies a mind that learned to remember and share. When technology disappears, what remains is not enough to restore the lost world immediately, but it is enough to make another beginning possible. A human infant enters the world with potential, but little ability to survive alone. It cannot find food, regulate danger, move across the landscape, or understand the intentions of those nearby. For years, it depends on people for warmth, protection, nourishment, guidance, and reassurance. This long dependence is not a weakness left behind by evolution. It is connected to the way human beings grow, learn, and build large brains through experience after birth. A child absorbs language, social rules, practical movements, and knowledge of place. But that learning requires time and other people. No city, archive, or government invented this arrangement. It was already present when human groups lived without streets, written law, or formal institutions. The origins of human continuity can be found beside the child, where survival depends on adults who remain close enough to notice hunger, illness, fear, and danger. Care may have been provided by parents, relatives, and other members of a group, although exact arrangements varied and cannot be reconstructed. What is clear is that a developing child creates demands that one adult would struggle to meet. Food must be gathered or prepared. Shelter must be maintained. Threats must be watched. Children may need protection and instruction. Shared care gives a group flexibility, allowing attention and labor to move between people when one person is tired, injured, absent, or occupied. This does not mean every early community was peaceful or supportive. Human relationships have always included tension, loss, neglect, and conflict. Yet populations could not continue across generations unless enough children received enough care to reach maturity and learn the skills needed for adult life. The family, understood as a network of close relationships, became one of the oldest structures able to carry life through uncertainty. Its boundaries differed among societies, but its basic function remained recognizable. Children connected the present to a future that no adult would fully see. Through them, gestures, sounds, routes, food practices, and ways of responding to others could move beyond a single lifetime. This is one reason the human past did not need perfect records to continue. Much of what mattered entered memory before a child could explain it. A young person learned the rhythm of work by watching, the meaning of warning through tone, and the shape of trust through repeated presence. These quiet lessons formed an inheritance more durable than many institutions. When a state collapsed, a tax system could vanish, but adults still had to feed children by morning. When trade weakened, households still had to divide what remained. When people migrated, they carried the young, and the need to protect them helped preserve cooperation during movement. The beginning of humanity was renewed whenever a child learned to recognize a face, follow a voice, copy a movement, or wait for help. Each act tied biology to culture. The body supplied the capacity to learn, while the group supplied the knowledge worth learning. Neither could replace the other. A child without care could not reach the stage at which inherited knowledge became useful. A community without children could not carry its practices into another generation. This mutual dependence gave human continuity a living structure. It also explains why family networks often remain when larger orders fracture. They are close enough to respond immediately, flexible enough to change roles, and significant enough to motivate effort when formal rewards disappear. They cannot solve every crisis, and they can fail under severe pressure, but they require fewer external systems than armies, courts, or markets. Before civilization could preserve itself in stone, it preserved itself through people who stayed near the young. What survived repeated resets was not a single family model, but the deeper pattern of shared responsibility around vulnerable children, the slow transfer of knowledge, and the recognition that human life continues only when someone carries another person through the years in which survival cannot yet be managed alone. Archaeology cannot recover every act of care, because most human attention leaves no mark. A hand that carried water, a person who stayed near someone in pain, or a group that shared food may disappear completely from the record. Yet some ancient skeletons preserve injuries, illnesses, or physical conditions that would have made life more difficult. When an individual survived long enough for a broken bone to heal, or lived for years with limited mobility, missing teeth, or chronic disease, researchers may ask whether assistance from others contributed to that survival. The evidence must be handled carefully. Healing does not prove affection, and disability does not always mean helplessness. People can adapt, compensate, and remain active in ways that bones alone cannot show. Still, in some cases, survival would likely have required access to food, protection, or practical support during periods when movement and work were restricted. These traces matter because they reveal that human continuity was not built only through strength. It also depended on the ability of a group to keep vulnerable members alive long enough for knowledge, relationships, and experience to remain within the community. The beginning of humanity was shaped in settings where injury could quickly become dangerous. A damaged leg might limit travel. Severe dental loss could make some foods difficult to eat. Illness could reduce the ability to gather, carry, or defend. Help might take many forms: sharing softer food, slowing movement, adjusting tasks, maintaining shelter, or allowing time for recovery. Archaeology rarely identifies which action occurred, who provided it, or why. It can only show that some individuals continued living after serious physical challenges. This is enough to suggest cooperation without turning evidence into a sentimental story. Care may have emerged from attachment, obligation, kinship, mutual dependence, social expectation, or a mixture of motives. Human groups did not need to understand care as a moral philosophy for it to become useful. Supporting an injured hunter, an experienced craft worker, a parent, or an older person could preserve skills and relationships that benefited others. Yet assistance may also have been given to people who offered no immediate material return. The record cannot measure compassion directly, but it does show that survival sometimes extended beyond what isolated physical capacity would predict. Such support would have strengthened the transfer of knowledge across generations. An older or injured person might still remember routes, seasons, materials, social ties, or methods that younger members had not yet mastered. A person unable to perform one task might contribute through another. This flexibility allowed a community to distribute ability rather than demand the same performance from everyone. Modern societies formalize parts of this process through medicine, institutions, and specialized care, but the underlying pattern is far older. People notice weakness, adjust behavior, and redirect effort towards someone whose survival depends on others. These responses are imperfect and unequal, and no ancient society should be imagined as universally protective. Neglect, exclusion, and violence also belong to human history. The important point is narrower. Enough care occurred, often enough, for vulnerable people to survive and remain part of social life. That pattern could pass through collapse because it did not require a palace, archive, or state. It required proximity, recognition, practical knowledge, and a willingness to share limited effort. When larger systems failed, these close forms of assistance could become even more important. A household might lose access to distant specialists, yet still know how to feed someone, support an injured limb, or remain near the sick. Such actions could not cure every condition, and they should never be confused with modern medical treatment. Their importance lies in continuity. They kept human lives connected while bodies healed, weakened, aged, or changed. What survived repeated resets was not only the strongest body, but the social capacity to make weakness temporarily bearable, allowing people and knowledge to remain present when isolation might have ended both. Empires depend on distance. They require roads, messengers, officials, records, storage, taxation, and stability for orders to move from one place to another. Families and close networks work differently. Their strength comes from proximity. People know who is hungry, who is injured, who can repair a roof, who remembers a route, and who needs help before nightfall. When a political system weakens, this local knowledge can remain active after distant authority becomes uncertain. A household cannot replace a state, and family ties do not guarantee safety or fairness. Yet they often survive disruption because they are renewed through daily contact rather than maintained by large institutions. Food is shared nearby, children are taught face to face. Tools are borrowed between people who expect to meet again. News travels through trusted voices. In such settings, survival depends less on formal office and more on relationships tested by time. The beginning of humanity rested on this closeness. Small groups had to remember one another's abilities, limits, and obligations. No central archive recorded who could find water or who knew how to prepare a plant. Knowledge lived in people, and relationships determined whether that knowledge could be reached. Later civilizations expanded cooperation across territories, but they never removed the need for small networks beneath them. Markets depend on households. Armies depend on families that raise children. Cities depend on people who care for the sick, prepare food, and pass language from one generation to the next. When those larger systems fracture, the underlying network may become visible again. Historical collapses often forced people to move, reduce consumption, change occupations, or rely heavily on relatives and neighbours. Some communities broke apart, and many individuals were left vulnerable. Others reorganized around smaller units of trust. A craft worker might teach a family member rather than serve a distant institution. A farmer might exchange food with a nearby household. A widow, an older person, or an orphan might be absorbed into a kin network, though such support was never universal. These adjustments did not preserve the old order unchanged. They preserved enough continuity for daily life to continue. Language remained in conversation. Recipes survived in preparation. Stories moved through memory. Children learned names, boundaries, warnings, and obligations from people nearby. This is how a society can lose monuments and still retain a human world. The loss of government may alter law, trade, defense, and access to resources, but it does not erase every bond at once. Close relationships can carry fragments of the system into new conditions, preserving practices whose institutions no longer exist. A ritual may remain within a household after its temple is gone. A building technique may continue in villages after workshops disappear. A crop may be replanted long after the state that organized its distribution has ended. The origins of human resilience lie in this ability to reduce scale without reducing life to nothing. People can move from coordination to smaller cooperation, even when the transition is painful and incomplete. Family networks are not always gentle. They can impose duties, exclude outsiders, preserve inequality, and intensify conflict. Their durability should not be confused with moral perfection. What matters is that they require fewer supports than empires do. They can operate through memory, presence, and repeated exchange. Because of this, they often become carriers of knowledge during disruptions. A child who learns from a grandparent, a neighbour who shares a tool, or a relative who offers shelter may preserve more than one life. Each act keeps a thread connected between what was known before and what can still be learned afterward. Civilizations may organize millions, but continuity often passes through a few people gathered close enough to notice one another. When the larger structure disappears, these small networks do not recreate it. They do something more basic. They keep human beings, skills, and memory together long enough for another social world to form. Fire is one of the oldest technologies that continued to shape human life long after the first use of flame had been forgotten. Archaeological evidence suggests that different human populations interacted with fire across a very long period, but researchers still debate when controlled use became regular in every region. The safest conclusion is not a single date. It is that fire gradually became woven into survival. It provided warmth in cold conditions, light after sunset, a way to prepare food, and a place around which people could remain together. None of these uses was simple. Flame had to be protected from wind and rain. Fuel had to be collected. Embers had to be watched. Heat had to be controlled closely enough to help rather than destroy. The beginning of human dependence on fire was therefore also the beginning of repeated attention. A fire that survived through the night represented stored effort. A fire that went out could mean more work, greater exposure, and the loss of a useful center within camp. Cooking may have made many foods softer, safer, or easier to digest, although its effects differed according to the food, the method, and the people involved. Heat could reduce some biological hazards, break down tough plant tissues, and change the texture of meat. It also allowed ingredients to be combined in ways that raw eating did not. Over time, this may have influenced daily schedules, patterns of sharing, and the kinds of places people chose to occupy. Yet fire should not be treated as a magical cause that alone created humanity. Human evolution involved many interacting pressures, and no single technology explains the body, brain, or society. Fire mattered because it entered an already social life and became useful through cooperation. Someone gathered wood, someone watched the flame, someone brought food close to the heat, someone noticed when smoke shifted or sparks threatened dry material. These actions required practical knowledge that could be shown, copied, corrected, and remembered without writing. The body learned distance from heat, the hand learned how to move fuel, and the eye learned the difference between a steady ember and an unstable flame. Such knowledge could pass through generations because it was used often. It did not depend on a palace or archive. It depended on presence. Fire also changed the space around human beings. Darkness did not disappear, but a small circle became visible. Cold did not end, but warmth could be concentrated. Predators were not removed from the landscape, yet smoke, light, and human activity may have altered how some animals approached a camp. The fire created a boundary that was practical rather than permanent. Inside it, tools could be repaired, food could be prepared, and people could remain awake together for a little longer. Outside it, the night continued. This contrast may have helped organize attention, rest, and social contact, though the details of prehistoric experience cannot be known. What can be said with confidence is that controlled heat became one of the most portable forms of human technology. It could be recreated from local fuel, maintained with simple tools, and taught directly. When settlements failed or populations moved, fire did not require a large institution to survive. The knowledge could travel in memory, habit, and embers carried carefully from one place to another. Its durability came from usefulness repeated every day. People did not need to understand combustion scientifically to recognize dry fuel, sheltered ground, useful smoke, or dangerous sparks. Each successful flame joined observation to memory. In this way, fire became more than an object. It became a practiced relationship between human bodies, available materials, weather, and time. Across later civilizations, hearths changed into ovens, furnaces, lamps, kilns, and stoves, but the central principle remained. Human beings learned to place heat where it could transform material and protect life. Beneath every later city, that ancient ability remained quietly active. Fire could survive across generations because its knowledge did not need to be stored in writing. It could be carried in repeated movements, familiar materials, and close observation. A child or inexperienced adult could watch how dry grass caught a spark, how thin twigs fed the first flame, and how larger pieces of wood were added only after heat became steady. The lesson was not delivered as an abstract theory. It appeared through timing, distance, touch, smell, and correction. Too much fuel could smother a weak flame. Damp wood could produce smoke without useful heat. Wind could spread sparks beyond the hearth. A person learned by seeing what happened and remembering which choices worked. This kind of knowledge also belongs to the body. Hands learn how close they can move toward heat. Eyes learn the color and movement of embers. Ears notice the difference between a quiet fire and one beginning to crack sharply. The beginning of humanity's long relationship with flame was therefore also a history of attention passed from one person to another. No single generation needed to invent every step again. Each inherited a practical pattern and adjusted it to local weather, fuel, and need. In a forest, wood might be abundant but wet. On open grassland, fuel could be scattered and the wind harder to control. In colder regions, maintaining warmth could demand more preparation. Different communities developed different methods, and archaeology cannot recover all of them. What remained common was the need to understand the conditions around the flame. Fire was never separate from place. It depended on shelter, season, available material, and human judgment. This made teaching essential. A mistake could waste fuel or threaten a camp, so knowledge had value only when it could be reproduced safely enough. People may have learned through demonstration, imitation, warning, and repeated responsibility, though the exact social arrangements are unknown. Someone first gathered fuel. Later, that person might be trusted to place it. Eventually, the same learner could maintain heat through the night or revive embers in the morning. Skill grew slowly through tasks that became familiar. This pattern still exists in many forms of learning. Reading can explain a process, but reliable control often comes only after the hands and senses have practiced it. Fire also encouraged continuity because it rewarded regular care. A neglected flame weakened. A protected ember preserved earlier effort and made the next fire easier. In this sense, the hearth held a small memory of previous work. It connected evening to morning and one camp to another when embers were carried carefully. Such transport would have required suitable material and caution, and it was not always possible, but the broader principle is clear. Heat could be maintained, renewed, and transferred through knowledge rather than large infrastructure. When political systems later collapsed, people did not need official institutions to remember how to cook, warm a shelter, harden certain materials, or create light. These practices remained close to daily life. Their survival was supported by repetition. What is used every day is encountered by many people, and what many people understand is harder to erase completely. Yet knowledge could still be lost locally when populations declined, environments changed, or specialized methods depended on rare materials. Continuity was never automatic. It required living teachers, attentive learners, and enough stability for practice to continue. Fire endured because its basic principles could be relearned from ordinary surroundings and shared directly. Around the hearth, useful experience could also be shared while food cooked and tools were repaired, allowing observation to occur without formal instruction. The learner did not need a complete explanation of combustion. Repeated contact with consequences gradually turned uncertain movement into dependable practice. Its history was written not only in ash and charcoal, but in posture, caution, patience, and the quiet confidence of knowing when a flame needed more air, more fuel, or simply more time. The hearth did more than produce heat. It created a place toward which movement returned. People brought fuel, food, tools, and attention into the same small area, and this repeated gathering gave the fire a social importance beyond its practical use. Around controlled heat, tasks could overlap. Food could soften while a tool was repaired. A child could watch an adult work. Someone returning from outside could enter a warmer space and become visible to others. The beginning of human life around fire was not the beginning of family or cooperation, because both were older than any hearth. Yet fire gave those relationships a physical center. It drew bodies close enough for observation, conversation, and shared timing. Archaeology cannot recover the exact words spoken beside ancient flames, and it cannot tell us what every gathering meant. What it can show is that hearths often became repeated features within camps and dwellings, leaving ash, charcoal, heated stone, and altered soil. These traces suggest that certain places were used again and again. Repetition matters because it turns space into memory. A person learns where fuel is kept, where smoke moves, where food is placed, and where it is safe to sit. The arrangement becomes familiar without needing formal explanation. In later villages and cities, the materials changed, but the organizing principle remained. Ovens, braziers, fireplaces, and stoves concentrated heat within domestic space. They supported cooking, warmth, craft, and social contact. The modern kitchen may contain metal, glass, electricity, and precise controls, yet it still gathers people around transformed food and shared routines. Meals often begin before anyone sits down. They begin with washing, cutting, heating, waiting, carrying, and noticing. These movements create small forms of cooperation that resemble older patterns, even when the technology is entirely different. A person prepares ingredients while another sets a surface. Someone tastes, adjusts, cleans, or watches. The actions are ordinary, but they renew a social arrangement in which heat becomes the center of coordinated care. This continuity should not be romanticized. Domestic labor has often been unequal, hidden, or imposed. Kitchens can reflect hierarchy as well as belonging. Fire itself can burn, suffocate, destroy shelter, or spread beyond control. Its value always depended on knowledge, attention, and social organization. Yet these risks also help make the hearth a place of responsibility. Someone had to notice what was happening. Someone had to decide when enough fuel had been added. Someone had to keep children, clothing, dry grass, or stored material at a safe distance. The origins of civilization remained visible in these repeated acts of management. Before large systems could regulate cities, people learned to regulate a small field of heat. Before institutions stored grain, households learned to transform food through fire. Before written schedules divided the day, flames and meals helped organize periods of work, rest, and gathering. When larger orders collapsed, the hearth could continue because it depended on local materials and familiar practice. A ruined government could no longer maintain roads, but a household might still protect embers. A trade network could fail, yet people could still boil, roast, dry, smoke, or warm what remained available. The methods varied widely, and not every community used fire in the same way, but the need to manage heat crossed many environments and societies. What survived was not one ancient kitchen preserved unchanged. It was the habit of placing human life around controlled warmth, using it to alter food, support bodies, and create a temporary center of safety. Even now, when a room grows quiet and a meal is prepared, the pattern returns in a changed form. Its endurance came not from remaining unchanged, but from being simple enough to adapt slowly whenever materials, homes, climates, and generations changed around it once again. Beneath modern surfaces, there is still a circle of attention around heat, and within that circle, people continue one of humanity's oldest shared arrangements. Speech allowed human experience to travel farther than one body and last longer than one moment. A person who found water beyond a ridge could return and guide others without forcing everyone to search blindly. Someone who noticed dangerous animals near a path could warn the group before another person reached the same place. Knowledge of weather, food, movement, injury, and social behavior could be shared through sound, gesture, and attention. Language did not remove uncertainty, and spoken information could be mistaken, forgotten, or misunderstood. Yet it created a powerful possibility. One individual's experience could become useful to people who had not been present. This changed the scale of learning. Without communication, the person would need to discover many risks alone. With communication, the cost of one mistake could sometimes protect others. Human language is complex, and its origins cannot be reconstructed from fossils with precision. Researchers continue to study how speech, gesture, anatomy, social life, and cognition develop together. No single moment can be identified as the birth of language. What can be said safely is that human survival became deeply connected to systems of shared meaning. Voices, facial attention, hand movements, and repeated sounds allowed people to coordinate action and preserve useful distinctions. A group could separate one plant from another, one root from another, or one person's responsibility from another's. The beginning of humanity was therefore not only a history of bodies adapting to landscapes, it was also a history of information moving between bodies. Words made absence easier to manage. A speaker could refer to an animal no longer visible, a place beyond the horizon, or an event that happened before a child was born. This ability widened the human world beyond what the senses could detect at that moment. It also allowed planning. People could discuss where to move, what to carry, who might remain near children, or how resources might be divided, although the exact forms of prehistoric conversation are unknown. Language supported cooperation because it allowed expectations to become clearer, but it did not guarantee agreement. People could deceive, argue, exclude, or remember events differently. The same capacity that carried warnings could also carry error. Its durability came not from perfect truth, but from constant use and correction within life. Listeners compared words with experience. Advice that repeatedly failed might lose authority, while reliable knowledge could become familiar through repetition. In this way, spoken communication acted as a living archive, renewed whenever people gathered, worked, travelled, or rested together. The archive was fragile because it depended on memory, but it was also mobile because it required no building. When communities moved, language moved with them. When tools broke, words could still explain where materials had been found or how a task had once been performed. When older people could no longer travel easily, they could still contribute knowledge through speech if others understood and remembered it. Near the origins of human culture, this transfer between generations helped separate biological inheritance from learned inheritance. Children did not need to be born knowing every root, plant, sound, or social rule. They could acquire distinctions from people already familiar with the local world. Each generation received language already in use, then altered it through new experience. No language remained completely unchanged, yet the human capacity to build shared meaning continued. That capacity survived political collapse because it was distributed across ordinary speakers rather than held only by rulers or specialists. A state might lose its records, but households could still name relatives, describe danger, teach work, and recount where they came from. Spoken knowledge could preserve only part of the past, and every retelling could reshape it. Even so, language kept experience from ending entirely with the person who first lived through it. Before libraries stored knowledge on shelves, human voices stored it in relationships, allowing memory to cross the distance between one life and another. Writing is one of humanity's most powerful methods for preserving knowledge, but it is not the only one. For long periods, many communities remembered the past without books, inscriptions, or permanent archives. Knowledge remained alive through speech, repetition, performance, naming, and shared practice. A route could be remembered through a sequence of landmarks. A family connection could be preserved through recited ancestry. Rules could be repeated in formal language until their wording became familiar. Seasonal knowledge could be carried in stories that linked rain, animals, plants, and movement. These systems were not careless substitutes for writing. They were organized forms of memory shaped by the needs of particular communities. Their reliability depended on repetition, social attention, and the presence of people responsible for remembering. Spoken traditions could preserve important information for generations, although every tradition also changed over time. Memory is never a perfect recording. Details may be lost, combined, simplified, or adapted to new circumstances. Yet writing also requires interpretation, copying, protection, and access. A written archive can burn, decay, or become unreadable when the language or script is forgotten. Oral knowledge survives differently. It remains distributed among living people. This makes it vulnerable to population loss, displacement, and the death of knowledgeable individuals, but it also makes it mobile. A community can carry language, songs, genealogies, and practical instructions while moving across a landscape. At the beginning of human culture, memory had to travel in bodies because there was nowhere else for it to remain. The voice became a bridge between what one generation had experienced and what another still needed to learn. Spoken history also helped communities understand relationships. Knowing who belonged to which family, who had obligations to whom, and which places were connected to particular groups could guide marriage, exchange, inheritance, and cooperation. These arrangements varied widely and should not be treated as one universal system. Still, kinship knowledge was often too important to leave to chance. Names and relationships were repeated because they organized social life. In the same way, laws did not need to be written before they could be remembered. Expectations about property, injury, marriage, hospitality, or conflict could be taught through judgment, example, and repeated formula. Such rules were not always fair, and memory did not prevent disagreement. Their significance lies in showing that social order can continue without documents when enough people recognize and enforce shared expectations. Environmental knowledge was especially suited to oral transmission because it could be tied directly to place. A story about a dangerous crossing might be retold near the river itself. A warning about a plant could be demonstrated while gathering. The movement of animals could be connected to seasons, winds, or stars through repeated observation. Words and experience supported one another. Children heard the account, saw the landscape, and learned when the knowledge applied. This connection made oral memory practical rather than merely decorative. When states collapsed and written administration declined, spoken knowledge could continue in homes, fields, workshops, and paths. People might forget the names of former rulers while remembering where to plant, how to settle disputes, or which relatives could offer help. The loss of writing could still be severe, especially for mathematics, complex administration, distant correspondence, and accumulated scholarship. Oral tradition could not preserve every detail or replace every document, but it could keep a community oriented when formal archives disappeared. What survived was often knowledge repeated often enough to become woven into identity and daily action. The origins of human continuity therefore belong as much to listening as to speaking. A memory endured because someone told it, someone else recognized its importance, and another person carried it forward in a slightly altered voice. Its strength was not permanence, but renewal through every act of careful listening and repeated use within changing communities. Across collapse, migration, and changing language, the spoken word remained an archive that lived only by being shared. Modern speech still carries functions that are far older than writing. A parent calling a child by name, a family repeating the story of where relatives came from, or an adult warning someone about a dangerous place all belong to patterns that long preceded books. The words have changed, and the settings are different, but the social work remains recognizable. Language identifies people, directs attention, marks belonging, and transfers experience. It helps a group decide who is near, who is absent, what happened before, and what may happen next. These uses are so ordinary that their age is easy to miss. They survive because every generation encounters them before understanding grammar, history, or formal education. A child first experiences language as presence. A familiar voice approaches, comforts, corrects, or calls attention to something nearby. Tone may arrive before meaning. Repetition makes certain sounds predictable. Names become connected to faces, objects, places, and relationships. Through this slow process, language enters daily life not as a system of rules, but as a map of the human world. Kinship terms are part of that map. Words for parents, siblings, grandparents, spouses, and other relatives differ across languages and cultures, and no single family structure can represent all societies. Yet naming relationships remains important because it helps people understand connection, obligation, distance, and trust. The origins of human community are still faintly visible whenever a child learns not only who a person is, but how that person is related to others. Lullabies and soothing speech preserve another ancient function. Their melodies and forms vary widely, but a calm, repeated voice can help create familiarity during rest. It does not prove that every prehistoric community used the same practice, and no ancient song can be reconstructed with certainty. Still, the close link between voice, caregiving, and sleep belongs to the biological and social conditions in which human children grow. A quiet rhythm tells the body that someone remains nearby. In modern homes, where walls, electric light, and recorded sound surround the listener, the basic effect of a familiar voice may continue beneath the technology. Warnings also preserve old structures. Do not touch, stay close, the ground is slippery, or come back before dark are simple phrases, yet each turns another person's attention toward risk. They compress experience into a few sounds that can change behavior before harm occurs. The danger may now involve traffic, machinery, heat, or electricity rather than an animal path or unstable riverbank, but the principle remains. Language allows one nervous system to guide another. Family stories perform a different task. They place individual lives within a longer sequence, connecting children to people and events they did not witness. These stories can preserve truth, but they may also simplify, omit, or reshape the past. Their value does not depend on perfect accuracy alone. They tell listeners which memories a group considers important enough to repeat. A migration, a difficult season, a lost home, a marriage, or a remembered act of care may become part of how later generations understand themselves. Across historical disruption, such stories can preserve continuity even when documents disappear. What survives is not an unchanged sentence from the distant past, but a recurring human need to explain belonging through words. Even brief phrases can hold accumulated lessons, because their usefulness is tested repeatedly in kitchens, doorways, paths, workplaces, and bedsides, where ordinary speech quietly coordinates attention, responsibility, comfort, and shared memory across generations. Modern conversation therefore contains many layers of inheritance. A greeting manages peaceful approach, a name stabilizes identity, a warning shares danger, a lullaby supports closeness, a family account joins present lives to absent ones. None of these requires a monument, and all can travel through collapse, migration, and technological change. Beneath complex language, human beings still use voices for the oldest task of all, carrying enough meaning between people for life, memory, and relationship to continue. Long before metal, engines, or written plans, human beings extended the abilities of their bodies by using materials found around them. Stone could cut where fingers could not, wood could reach farther than an arm, bone could become a point, a needle, or a handle. Plant fibers could bind, carry, trap, or hold. These materials did not create human intelligence, but they allowed observation and intention to take physical form. A tool begins when someone recognizes that an object can do more than remain what it appears to be. A stone is no longer only part of the ground when its edge is selected for cutting. A branch becomes something different when it is shaped, hardened, or used to support weight. The beginning of technology, therefore, lies in a quiet mental step, seeing a possible action inside ordinary material. Archaeology preserves stone more often than wood, hide, cord, or plant fiber, so the surviving record is incomplete. Early toolkits were probably more varied than the objects that endure. Researchers can study wear, fractures, residues, and manufacturing traces, but many everyday implements have vanished. This uneven preservation can make the past seem dominated by stone, when living people would have depended on many perishable materials. What matters is not a single first tool, because tool use developed gradually and was not limited to one species or one place. The important pattern is the growing ability to choose material, shape it, and connect it to a task. Cutting, scraping, piercing, pounding, digging, carrying, and binding each reduced the limits of bare hands. Yet every tool still depended on the body. A sharp edge was useless without controlled pressure. A digging stick required balance, grip, and judgment. Cordage demanded patient twisting and an understanding of fibers. The hand supplied movement, while the mind compared results and remembered what worked. This cooperation between body, material, and memory became one of the oldest forms of human continuity. A tool could be lost, but the method of making another could survive in a person who had practiced it. Skills could move across generations even when objects broke, decayed, or were left behind during migration. The origins of human resilience can be seen in this ability to rebuild usefulness from local surroundings. People did not need the same stone, tree, or animal bone everywhere. They needed the capacity to inspect what was available and adapt technique to material. That flexibility allowed groups to enter new environments without carrying every object from the old one. It also encouraged experimentation. A point that snapped might be reshaped. A binding that loosened might be twisted differently. A heavier tool might be balanced with a handle. Innovation did not always require sudden invention. It often grew through small corrections repeated over time. Modern technology still rests on these basic principles. A knife extends cutting, a container extends carrying, a lever extends force, a needle joins flexible material, a handle changes grip and distance. The materials have become more complex, and production may involve machines, laboratories, and global supply, but the underlying logic remains ancient. Human beings alter matter so that the body can perform beyond its unaided limits. When civilizations lose specialized production, the most advanced tools may disappear first because they depend on rare knowledge, precise parts, or distant resources. Simpler methods can persist because their materials are local and their use is visible. This does not make them easy. Producing a reliable stone edge, strong cord, or balanced wooden implement requires practice and judgment. Their durability comes from being teachable through direct experience. Such knowledge could remain alive wherever makers, learners, materials, and enough time were brought together again. What survived repeated disruptions was not one perfect toolkit, but the habit of asking what a material could become, how the hand could guide it, and how a useful form could be made again after the original object was gone. A tool can be described in words, but the skill of using it often lives somewhere deeper than language. A person may understand that a blade must meet wood at an angle, yet still press too hard, move too quickly, or lose control of the cut. Reliable skill develops when the body learns timing, pressure, balance, and correction through repeated contact with material. The hand notices resistance, the wrist adjusts, the shoulders relax or tighten, the eyes compare the intended shape with the one actually forming. These small changes happen too quickly and too quietly to be explained in full while they occur. They become a form of memory, carried through movement. This is why practical knowledge has often survived without detailed instructions. A learner can stand nearby, watch the sequence, imitate the posture, and receive correction when the result begins to fail. The teaching may include words, but demonstration gives those words a physical meaning. Softer, slower, or closer becomes understandable only when the learner feels the difference. Near the origins of human technology, such embodied learning would have been essential. Stone could fracture unpredictably. Fibers could separate if twisted poorly. Wood could split along its grain. Bone could snap when force was applied in the wrong direction. Each material answered the hand differently, and skill grew from noticing those answers. Archaeology can preserve finished tools and sometimes the traces of how they were made, but it cannot preserve the full rhythm of manufacture. It does not show every pause, failed strike, adjusted grip, or moment when an experienced maker guided another person's hand. Those invisible actions may have been as important as the surviving object. A technique continued because people repeated it often enough for movement to become dependable. This kind of memory is sometimes called procedural memory, the learned ability to perform an action without consciously describing every step. It supports activities such as tying, cutting, grinding, weaving, shaping, carrying, and balancing. Modern neuroscience studies how practice changes performance, but the basic human experience is ancient. We learn many actions by doing them until attention no longer needs to control each detail separately. That efficiency frees the mind to notice the wider task, the condition of the tool, and the movements of other people nearby. Yet automatic movement is not fixed. Skilled action remains responsive. A maker changes pressure when material becomes thinner, slows when an edge approaches the hand, or alters posture when fatigue appears. The origins of craftsmanship lie in this union of habit and attention. Too little practice makes movement uncertain. Too much careless repetition can preserve error. Good teaching interrupts mistakes before they harden into habit. Because of this, knowledge survives best in communities where learners can observe experienced people repeatedly and where correction is accepted as part of work. When written records disappear, such communities can still preserve methods through workshops, households, fields, and shared tasks. The name of an inventor may be lost, and the theory behind a process may fade, but the sequence of useful movement can remain. A basket may continue to be woven because fingers remember tension. A stone may continue to be sharpened because the hand recognizes the right sound and resistance. A knot may continue to hold because someone learned when to pull, cross, and tighten. These skills are fragile if only one person carries them, yet remarkably durable when many people practice them. Their survival does not depend on an unchanged object. It depends on repeated contact between bodies, materials, and teachers. Even when materials change, the trained body can recognize familiar relationships between force and form, carrying an old method into new circumstances without fully preserving every earlier detail or explanation. Across disruption, migration, and changing tools, human beings have preserved knowledge by allowing action itself to become an archive, one that can be opened only through practice and passed onward through patient demonstration. Modern tools may look completely different from the objects used by early humans, yet many still depend on a small number of ancient principles. Cutting separates material through an edge. Grinding changes a surface through repeated friction. A lever multiplies force by changing distance and balance. A container allows the body to carry more than the hands alone can hold. Binding joins separate pieces into a larger whole. These principles are simple to name, but their power comes from endless variation. A stone blade, a metal knife, and a surgical instrument all use an edge, though their materials, precision, and purposes differ greatly. A wooden pole, a crowbar, and a mechanism inside a machine may all use leverage, even when the surrounding technology hides the relationship. The beginning of human tool-making was not a march toward one inevitable modern world. It was a long accumulation of ways to redirect force, protect the body, alter material, and organize work. Each method answered a practical limit. Fingers could not cut deeply enough, so edges extended them. Arms could not lift enough, so levers changed the task. Hands could carry only a little, so baskets, skins, vessels, and later carts expanded movement. Loose material could not hold shape, so twisting, weaving, fastening, and joining created structures that were stronger than their separate elements. Once these principles became familiar, they could move between materials. A cord might be made from plant fiber, hair, hide, or another flexible substance. A container might be woven, carved, sewn, or shaped from clay. The form changed with the environment, while the need remained. This ability to transfer an idea from one material to another is one reason technology survives disruption. A specific workshop may vanish, and a specialized tool may no longer be available, but people who understand the basic relationship between force and material can seek another solution. They may not recreate the lost object, yet they can preserve the underlying function. Industry extends this process through mathematics, standardized components, electricity, chemical knowledge, and global production. It can achieve levels of speed and accuracy that simple tools cannot approach. Still, advanced systems are built from connected actions that remain physically recognizable. Materials are cut, joined, lifted, moved, contained, heated, cooled, and measured. Machines perform many of these tasks, but the logic beneath them is older than machinery. The origins of technological continuity lie in the human habit of breaking a difficult problem into manageable actions. A shelter becomes possible through supports, joints, coverings, and anchors. Food storage becomes possible through sealing, drying, cooling, or keeping pests away. Transport becomes possible by reducing friction, distributing weight, or using the strength of animals, water, wind, or engines. Each solution combines basic principles with local knowledge. This does not mean that modern technology could easily be rebuilt after a severe collapse. Many devices depend on long chains of mining, refining, manufacturing, calibration, and scientific education. Once those chains break, knowing a principle is not the same as possessing the means to reproduce its most advanced form. Yet principles matter because they guide what can be attempted with what remains. They allow people to move from need toward experiment, rather than beginning without direction. Even in ordinary households, this grammar remains visible when a broken handle is replaced, a load is balanced, a tear is stitched, or several weak pieces are joined together to create a stronger form. Across historical losses, humans have repeatedly retained humble technologies because their workings can be seen, touched, practiced, and repaired. A knot reveals how it holds. A lever shows where force changes. A vessel demonstrates containment. An edge teaches through resistance. These visible relationships make knowledge portable. What survived was not one fixed inventory of tools, but a durable grammar of making, through which human beings continue to cut, bind, lift, carry, shape, connect, and adapt whatever materials each changing world placed within reach. Before food could be stored in granaries or transported across long roads, survival depended on reading the landscape directly. Water, shelter, edible plants, animal movement, wind, cloud, soil, and season all carried information. None of these signs spoke clearly on their own. Meaning came from repeated observation and from knowledge shared among people who had lived in the same environment long enough to notice patterns. A river that seemed calm in one season might rise quickly in another. A plant that was useful at one stage of growth might become bitter, tough, or unsafe later. Animal tracks could indicate recent movement, but their value depended on direction, freshness, weather, and the habits of the species. Human beings learned to connect small details into practical decisions. This ability did not require a written map, but it did require memory. A water source had to be remembered through distance, terrain, and landmarks. A safe crossing had to be recognized when the river changed. A path through forest or open ground had to be linked with the time of year in which it remained passable. The beginning of human expansion into varied environments depended on more than physical endurance. It depended on accumulated knowledge of place. No individual could discover everything alone, because mistakes involving water, food, cold, or exposure could be costly. Groups benefited when observations were compared and passed onward. One person might notice where birds gathered before rain. Another might remember which slope held snow longer. Someone else might know how insects, flowering plants, or changing winds signaled a seasonal shift. These signs were never perfectly reliable, and early people did not possess complete scientific explanations. Yet practical knowledge does not need to explain every cause before it can guide action. It grows when repeated outcomes are noticed and when failed expectations are corrected. Over generations, landscapes became filled with remembered distinctions. One valley offered shelter from wind. One riverbank produced useful reeds. One rocky area held stone suited to tools. One patch of woodland provided fuel that burned more steadily than another. Such knowledge turns space into a living network of possibilities and limits. Archaeology can reveal some of this through settlement patterns, food remains, tools, and the movement of materials, but much of the mental map has vanished. Paths fade, place names change. Spoken warnings disappear with the people who carried them. Even so, the continued occupation of difficult environments shows that human communities repeatedly learned how to match behavior to local conditions. This was not a single universal tradition. Coastal groups, forest communities, grassland populations, and people living in colder regions faced different demands. Their knowledge reflected the places they knew. When populations moved, inherited understanding could become less useful, and new learning had to begin. Migrants might carry general skills of observation while depending on local people or long experience to understand unfamiliar plants, animals, and seasons. This combination of old capacity and new knowledge was central to human adaptability. The body supplied senses, attention, movement, and memory. Culture supplied names, warnings, routes, and methods of interpretation. Together, they allowed people to read surroundings that were always changing. Civilizations later built canals, roads, calendars, markets, and storage systems to reduce uncertainty, but those systems still rested on environmental knowledge. Farmers watched rainfall, sailors studied wind, settlements depended on water and soil. When larger systems failed, local understanding could become essential again. What survived repeated resets was not a perfect map of every place, but the habit of looking closely, remembering patterns, sharing observations, and treating the land as a source of information. That reading was never passive. It guided when to leave, where to pause, what to gather, which route to avoid, and how much could safely be taken before a place needed time to recover from human use and seasonal change. Long before humans wrote history, they learned to read the world beneath their feet. Cooking is often remembered as flavor, but its deeper history is practical. A method for preparing food can preserve knowledge about heat, timing, texture, safety, storage, and the limits of local ingredients. When people roast, boil, dry, smoke, grind, ferment, or combine foods, they do more than change taste. They alter how long food lasts, how easily it can be eaten, how much fuel is required, and how it can be shared among people of different ages and physical conditions. No single method belongs to all human groups, and many techniques developed independently in different environments. What links them is the repeated transformation of raw material through observation. A root that caused discomfort in one form might become usable after soaking, grinding, or heating. Meat could be dried or smoked to slow spoilage under suitable conditions. Grains could be crushed, mixed with water, and cooked into forms easier to divide and carry. Fermentation could change flavor and preservation, although the exact processes were often understood through experience long before microbes were known. The beginning of human food knowledge was therefore not a collection of written recipes. It was a chain of remembered consequences. People noticed what happened when food was left in shade, exposed to smoke, placed near heat, stored in a container, or mixed with another ingredient. Successful methods were repeated because they reduced waste or made difficult foods more useful. Failed methods also taught, sometimes at serious cost. Over time, practical rules became embedded in routine. A person might not explain why a vessel should remain covered, why a mixture needed more time, or why one plant had to be prepared differently from another. The method could still be preserved through habit, demonstration, and warning. Cooking also linked food to fuel. Every meal required decisions about wood, dung, charcoal, dry grass, or other available sources of heat, depending on place and period. A technique that demanded long heating might be practical where fuel was abundant and difficult where it was scarce. Communities adapted dishes to the energy available, the shape of vessels, the weather, and the time people could spend tending heat. This makes cuisine a record not only of ingredients, but of landscapes and labour. It remembers what could be gathered, what could be stored, and what could be cooked without exhausting nearby resources. Shared preparation added another layer of memory. One person washed, another cut, another watched the fire, and another divided the finished food. Children learned by staying close to these repeated actions. Older people could contribute judgment even when heavy work became difficult. The origins of human cooperation remained visible in the meal because eating safely often depended on several kinds of knowledge arriving at the same place. When communities migrated or political systems weakened, recipes could change while their central logic survived. A familiar grain might be replaced by another. A missing spice could disappear. A new vessel could alter texture. Yet the inherited sequence of soaking, grinding, heating, drying, or sharing might continue. This is why food traditions can outlive the institutions that once surrounded them. They are renewed daily and carried in the senses. Hands remember consistency. Eyes recognize color. The nose detects smoke, sourness, or spoilage. The tongue compares the present result with an expected one. Such judgments are not perfectly reliable, and traditional methods should not be assumed safe in every circumstance. Their historical importance lies in accumulated observation, not in immunity from error. In this way, the kitchen became a small workshop where memory, environment, cooperation, and necessity were joined through repeated daily practice. Every ordinary meal still contains traces of that archive, not as an unchanged survival from one distant past, but as a living record revised whenever people meet new climates, ingredients, tools, shortages, and needs. A modern meal can appear immediate, as if its ingredients simply belong together, yet almost every plate is the result of long histories of movement, selection, exchange, and adaptation. Grains, roots, fruits, animals, salt, oils, and spices reach their present forms through many generations of human choice and environmental change. Some foods were first managed close to where they grew wild. Others travelled far beyond their original regions through migration, trade, conquest, and ordinary contact between neighbouring communities. A recipe may therefore contain ingredients whose histories began in different climates and among people who never knew one another. The meal joins those histories quietly, without displaying the distances they crossed. Agriculture deepened this process by concentrating attention on certain plants and animals. Over time, people selected varieties that suited local soils, seasons, storage needs, taste, and labour. This did not happen everywhere in the same way, and it was never a single event. Farming emerged through different pathways in several regions. while hunting, gathering, herding, fishing, and cultivation continued in varied combinations. The beginning of settled food production did not erase older knowledge. Farmers still needed to understand weather, water, pests, wild plants, and animal behavior. What changed was the scale at which food could be organized, stored, exchanged, and tied to land. A grain stored through winter became more than nourishment. It became time held in a container. A seed saved for planting connected one harvest to another. Salt, drying, fermentation, and smoke extended that connection by delaying decay. These methods allowed food to travel farther and support people beyond the moment of gathering or slaughter. They also created new dependencies. A failed crop, damaged storehouse, or interrupted route could threaten communities that relied heavily on a narrow range of foods. The history inside a meal is therefore not only a story of abundance, it is also a record of risk. Civilizations expanded by moving food across distance, but households survived by preserving knowledge close to the body. Hands measured texture, eyes watched color. Families remembered what could be substituted when an ingredient was absent. When political systems weakened, imported foods might become rare, yet local staples and preparation methods could continue. A dish changed because necessity changed it. This adaptability is one reason food traditions endure. Their identity does not always depend on exact ingredients. It may rest on a sequence of actions, a shared vessel, a method of dividing portions, or a taste associated with home. Migration carries these patterns into new environments, where old methods meet unfamiliar materials. The result is neither complete preservation nor complete loss. It is a revised inheritance. The origins of human food culture remain visible in this ability to combine memory with circumstance. People keep what can still work, replace what cannot, and teach the altered method as if it had always belonged there. Modern global markets can hide this process by making distant ingredients seem ordinary. A spice from one region, a grain from another, and a cooking method shaped elsewhere may meet in one kitchen. Beneath the convenience lies a history of ecological change, labor, exchange, and sometimes coercion. No meal is a pure survival from a single ancient culture. Each is a layered result of contact. What survived repeated resets was the practice of turning available food into something storable, shareable, meaningful, and familiar. Through every migration and collapse, humans carried not only seeds and animals, but expectations about how a meal should feel, who should receive it, and when people should gather to eat. In this shifting pattern, every bite carries evidence that human continuity depends as much on adaptation as on preservation. The plate before us is therefore a small map of human movement, marked by losses, substitutions, and discoveries. It reminds us that survival rarely preserves the past unchanged. More often, it keeps the useful pattern while allowing the ingredients, tools, and meanings to shift. No community, however skilled, possessed every material, resource, or piece of knowledge it might need. Stones suitable for cutting could lie far from good farmland. Salt might be available near a coast, but scarce inland. Certain shells, pigments, woods, metals, or animal products came only from particular environments. Human groups therefore benefited from contact beyond their immediate surroundings. Archaeology sometimes reveals this contact when objects are found far from the places where their raw materials originated. A piece of obsidian may have travelled across mountains. Marine shells may appear deep inland. Stone, amber, copper, or other materials can move through many hands before reaching their final location. These finds do not always prove formal trade in the modern sense. Exchange could involve gifts, visits, marriage ties, seasonal meetings, shared journeys, or movement from one neighbouring group to another. The route may have been indirect, and the people using the final object may never have met those who first obtained the material. What the evidence does show is that human worlds were connected across distance long before roads, coins, or markets organised exchange on a large scale. The beginning of this pattern was rooted in unequal landscapes. One place offered what another lacked, and contact allowed people to reduce the limits of local supply. Material was only one thing that moved. Techniques, stories, names, warnings, and knowledge of routes could travel with people as well. A group receiving unfamiliar stone might also learn how it fractured. Someone entering a new region might hear where water remained during a dry season. A method of tying, shaping, storing, or cooking could spread without leaving a clear archaeological signature. This makes exchange difficult to measure. Objects survive more readily than explanations, yet the movement of objects suggests that information often travelled beside them. Such contact also carried risk. Strangers could be misunderstood, obligations could be disputed. Disease, competition, and conflict sometimes moved along the same routes as useful goods. Exchange was never automatically peaceful or equal. Powerful groups could control access, demand tribute, or benefit more than others. Even small communities might refuse contact or guard valuable resources. The durable principle was not harmony, but interdependence. People repeatedly discovered that isolation limited what could be obtained, repaired, learned, or replaced. Contact widened possibility. It allowed shortages in one area to be answered by abundance elsewhere, although only when relationships and routes remained open. Civilizations later expanded this principle into merchant networks, ports, caravans, taxation, and long-distance commerce. Cities depended on food, fuel, building materials, and labor, arriving from beyond their walls. When those networks failed, urban life could contract rapidly because local surroundings could not support the same population or specialization. Yet exchange itself did not disappear. It could shrink to nearby villages, kin groups, and travelers moving along familiar paths. The origins of human cooperation remained visible in these smaller movements. A tool passed from one household to another. Food was exchanged for labor. Information traveled with visitors. Local networks preserved connections even when imperial roads became unsafe or distant markets collapsed. The pattern can be seen without assuming that every distant object was purchased or carried by a professional trader. It may have moved gradually through repeated encounters, crossing cultural and linguistic boundaries one exchange at a time. Its journey reminds us that connection can exist without central planning, written contracts, or any participant understanding the route. What survived repeated resets was not a single economic system, but the recognition that another person might possess what one household lacked. That recognition encouraged people to maintain roots, remember obligations, and create reasons to meet again. Every exchanged object carried more than material value. It marked a relationship, however temporary, between different lives and places. Across generations, these quiet connections helped communities survive not because anyone possessed everything, but because human beings learned to move necessities, skills, and knowledge through the spaces between them. Exchange depends on more than the existence of something useful. It depends on the expectation that another person will respond in a way that makes contact worthwhile. A gift may create an obligation. A promise may guide a future meeting. A shared meal may signal temporary peace. A tool may be lent because the owner expects it to return. None of these arrangements requires coins or written contracts, but all require some ability to remember behavior. People notice who keeps an agreement, who delays, who takes more than expected, and who offers help when circumstances change. Trust grows through repeated encounters, not through perfect certainty. It allows people to act before every risk can be removed. At the beginning of human exchange, this capacity was deeply social. A person did not evaluate only an object. They also evaluated the relationship surrounding it. The same material could carry different meaning depending on who offered it, when it was given, and what had happened before. This made exchange flexible, but also fragile. A misunderstanding could damage cooperation. A broken obligation could close a route. A generous act could strengthen contact between households or groups. Archaeology can reveal objects moving across distance, yet it rarely preserves the conversations and expectations that allowed those movements to continue. The invisible structure was trust, supported by memory and social knowledge. Trust did not mean that early communities were peaceful or equal. Exchange could occur alongside rivalry, coercion, suspicion, and conflict. People could deceive one another, and stronger groups could impose terms on weaker ones. The importance of trust lies not in moral purity, but in reduced uncertainty. When people expect some pattern of behavior, they can plan beyond the present moment. A family may share food today because assistance may be returned during a later shortage. A craft worker may give an object in exchange for material expected after another journey. A traveller may follow a route because earlier meetings suggested that water, shelter, or information would be available. Such expectations connect separate moments into a continuing relationship. Reputation helps maintain this connection. In small networks, behavior is difficult to hide because people speak, remember, and compare experiences. Someone known for unreliable exchange may find future cooperation harder. Someone known for fairness may gain access to wider support. These judgments are never perfectly accurate, and rumors can harm innocent people, but the basic process allows communities to manage risk without central enforcement. The origins of social continuity can be seen in this shared memory of conduct. What one person experiences becomes information for others. Civilizations later expanded trust through weights, measures, contracts, currencies, courts, seals, and institutions. These systems make exchange possible among strangers who may never meet again. Yet even formal markets still depend on expectations that rules will be followed, goods will match descriptions, and agreements will be recognized. When institutions weaken, trust often contracts toward people who are known directly. Neighbors, relatives, and familiar traders may become more important because personal memory replaces distant enforcement. This can preserve local exchange, though it may also exclude outsiders and reduce wider cooperation. What survives repeated resets is not universal trust, but the human ability to build limited trust through repeated contact, remembered behavior, and mutual dependence. A relationship becomes stable enough for goods or knowledge to move, because each encounter leaves evidence for the next. Trust can be repaired, expanded, narrowed, or lost. Its strength lies in being renewable. No empire owns it, and no archive is required for its most basic form. Through this process, exchange becomes more than transfer. It becomes a test of whether memory can support cooperation across time, allowing separate households and communities to remain connected even when no authority stands above them to guarantee the outcome. Whenever two people act on the expectation that today's behavior will matter tomorrow, they continue one of the oldest systems supporting human exchange. Modern markets appear to operate through prices, contracts, banks, digital records, and institutions too complex to resemble early exchange. Yet beneath these systems lies an older social expectation. People must believe that others will deliver what they promise. Money works because it is accepted as a claim on future goods and labor. A contract matters because people expect its terms to be recognized. A bank balance has value because institutions, laws, and communities agree that the record will continue to mean something tomorrow. These arrangements are far more elaborate than a remembered favor between neighbors, but they still depend on trust stretched across distance. Modern exchange allows strangers to cooperate without knowing one another personally. Standard weights, currencies, receipts, warranties, and courts reduce the need for direct familiarity. They create shared rules that make behavior more predictable. A person can purchase food from someone whose family, history, and intentions remain unknown because systems stand between them. The seller trusts payment, the buyer trusts the product. Both trust that disputes can be addressed through recognized procedures. This is not complete trust in another individual. It is confidence distributed across many institutions. The beginning of organized exchange already contained this basic problem. How can people cooperate when they cannot inspect every action, remember every transaction, or remain close enough to enforce every promise? Early communities answered through reputation, kinship, repeated contact, and social obligation. Larger societies added records, officials, measures, and law. Each new layer allowed cooperation to expand, but none removed the need for human expectation. A rule is useful only when enough people believe it will be followed or enforced. A currency functions only while people continue accepting it. A supply chain moves because many separate participants perform tasks for others they may never meet. This hidden dependence becomes visible during disruption. When transport fails, information becomes unreliable, or institutions lose authority, people often narrow exchange toward familiar relationships. Local sellers, neighbors, relatives, and trusted workers gain importance because direct knowledge replaces distant guarantees. Credit may return to memory. Goods may be exchanged through personal obligation. Repairs may depend on someone known rather than a formal service. Such changes do not recreate an ancient economy, but they reveal the older structure supporting the modern one. Human beings still ask whether another person is dependable, whether a promise will be kept, and whether cooperation today will bring security tomorrow. At the origins of human exchange, these judgments were made within small groups where reputation traveled through conversation. In a global economy, they are partly delegated to institutions, ratings, documents, brands, and law. The scale changes, but the central uncertainty remains. Exchange always reaches into the future. Payment may come later. A product may be used after the seller is gone. A promise may depend on conditions that have not yet arrived. Trust allows people to cross that gap. It does not remove risk. Markets can fail, contracts can be broken, records can be manipulated, and institutions can protect some people better than others. Economic systems also carry inequality, coercion, and unequal access. Their complexity should not be mistaken for fairness. The deeper continuity is simply that no system of exchange can function through calculation alone. It requires a shared belief that actions will have recognizable consequences. What survived repeated resets was not one currency, law, or market structure. Those forms changed, vanished, and returned in new arrangements. What endured was the social capacity to establish value, remember obligation, judge reliability, and coordinate with people beyond the immediate household. Whenever someone accepts payment, lends a tool, signs an agreement, or sends goods toward an unseen buyer, they participate in a modern system built upon an ancient human problem. How can separate lives depend on one another without certainty? Civilization answers with institutions, but the first answer remains beneath them. Enough trust to act before the future is known or can be controlled. Human beings have long placed meaning into objects that were not necessary for immediate survival. Beads, pigments, carved forms, decorated tools, and carefully arranged burials appear in many archaeological contexts, though not everywhere, and not always for the same reasons. Such remains suggest that people used material things to communicate distinctions that food, shelter, and tools alone could not express. An ornament might have marked identity, relationship, age, status, memory, or belonging, but archaeology rarely allows one interpretation to be proven. The same object could carry several meanings, and those meanings could change across generations. Caution is therefore essential. A shell worn far from the coast shows movement and selection, but it does not tell us exactly what the wearer believed. Red pigment placed on a body may indicate deliberate practice, yet it cannot reveal a complete religious system. A burial containing objects may show that the dead were treated differently from ordinary refuse, but it does not allow us to reconstruct every emotion or idea surrounding death. The evidence is strongest when it shows repeated choice. Materials were gathered, modified, placed, or displayed in ways that required time and attention. Those actions suggest that human life had become organized not only around physical needs, but around shared understandings. At the beginning of symbolic culture, an object could stand for something beyond its material form. A bead was still shell, bone, stone, or tooth, yet its value depended on how people recognized it. Meaning existed between minds. It had to be learned, remembered, and understood within a social setting. This made symbols both powerful and fragile. An object could survive after its meaning was forgotten. A sign familiar to one group could be meaningless to another. When communities moved or merged, symbols could be adopted, rejected, or transformed. Their durability came from repetition rather than permanence. People wore them, placed them, copied them, and taught others when they mattered. Art presents the same difficulty. Images on cave walls, portable carvings, patterns, and decorated surfaces show deliberate attention to form, but their purposes varied and often remain uncertain. Some may have related to memory, teaching, identity, place, ritual, or aesthetic pleasure. Many explanations have been proposed, yet no single theory accounts for every example. The safest conclusion is modest. Humans were capable of creating marks and objects whose importance exceeded their practical use. This capacity allowed communities to make invisible relationships visible. A mark could connect a person to a group. A burial place could connect the living to remembered individuals. A repeated design could link objects made at different times. Near the origins of humanity, such practices may have helped people organize belonging in communities that depended on cooperation and memory. They did not replace food, care, or tools. They added another layer through which people understood who they were among others. When political systems later collapsed, official monuments and emblems might lose authority, but the human capacity to create meaning through material forms remained. Families could preserve small objects, burial customs, clothing patterns, or household practices after states disappeared. New symbols could grow from old ones, even when their original explanations were lost. This does not mean every object survived unchanged or every tradition passed through every collapse. Many meanings vanished completely. Others were reinterpreted until only their outward form remained. What endured was the ability to treat matter as more than matter, allowing colour, shape, placement, and repetition to carry social memory. Across repeated disruptions, humans continued to mark difference, belonging, absence, and connection through things that could be seen and touched. The objects changed, but the need to make relationships visible remained, quietly linking living communities to people, places, and memories beyond the present moment. In this way, symbolic behavior became another portable inheritance, renewed whenever a community taught its members why an ordinary material should be noticed, protected, displayed, remembered, shared, or placed with special care. Ritual gives repeated human action a recognizable shape in time. A birth, a death, the return of a season, the beginning of a journey, or the gathering of a community can be marked by actions performed in a familiar order. These actions may include shared meals, washing, silence, music, movement, decoration, offerings, greetings, or the careful placement of objects. Their forms differ widely across societies, and archaeology rarely reveals their full meaning. Yet, repetition itself is significant. When people perform the same sequence at important moments, they create a bridge between one experience and earlier ones. The present becomes connected to memory, and memory becomes something that can be practiced rather than merely recalled. At the beginning of human social life, time was not measured by clocks, but it was still organized through change. Light returned, weather shifted, animals moved, plants flowered, children grew, bodies aged, and people died. Communities learned to notice these transitions. Some were practical because they guided movement, food gathering, planting, or preparation for cold. Others carried social meaning because they altered relationships and responsibilities. A child becoming an adult, a new partnership, or the death of a community member changed how people stood in relation to one another. Repeated customs could help make those changes visible. They told participants that something had ended, begun, or been transformed, even when no written document recorded it. Rituals should not be understood as evidence of one universal religion, or as proof that ancient people held specific beliefs. Similar actions can arise for different reasons. A burial may express grief, obligation, fear, respect, identity, or several motives at once. A seasonal gathering may combine exchange, courtship, food preparation, political negotiation, and shared memory. The evidence usually supports deliberate repetition more confidently than it supports a complete explanation. What matters for continuity is that repeated actions can be learned. A younger person watches where others stand, when they speak, what they carry, and how long they wait. Meaning is absorbed through participation. The body remembers the sequence even when no one explains every detail. This makes ritual another form of embodied memory related to tool use, cooking, and oral tradition. It survives through performance. If a community moves, the action can move with it. If a building disappears, the gathering may continue elsewhere. If words change, the order of gestures may remain recognizable. Repetition also offers stability during uncertainty. It cannot remove loss, hunger, conflict, or fear, but it can give people a shared way to respond. When someone dies, familiar actions tell the living what can be done next. When a season changes, preparation becomes collective rather than individual. When people meet after separation, greetings help reduce uncertainty and restore expected relations. The origins of social resilience are visible in these modest sequences. They turn private emotion and practical necessity into coordinated behavior. Yet rituals can also preserve hierarchy, exclusion, and unequal power. Their durability does not make them harmless or wise. Some practices disappear because later generations reject them, while others change because the conditions supporting them no longer exist. Continuity is therefore selective. What survives is often the need for patterned response rather than the exact form. Modern societies still mark birthdays, funerals, marriages, anniversaries, harvests, national events, and daily transitions. Even a repeated evening routine can divide activity from rest. Beneath these practices lies an ancient human capacity to make time socially visible. Civilizations may change calendars, institutions, and beliefs, but people continue to create order through actions repeated together. The pattern may be quiet, but each repetition teaches attention, timing, obligation, and belonging, allowing a group to recognize itself through shared behavior when larger structures no longer provide certainty or continuity. Across disruption, ritual helps communities say, without requiring permanent monuments, that this moment differs from the last, that certain people belong here, and that memory will be carried forward through what is done again. Modern life is filled with small rituals that rarely feel ancient because they are woven into ordinary routines. People greet one another in familiar ways, gather for meals, mark birthdays, attend funerals, exchange gifts, light candles, prepare a room for guests, or repeat the same actions before sleep. None of these customs is identical across cultures, and their meanings differ widely, yet they share a basic structure. Certain actions are repeated at certain moments so that people know how to enter, leave, remember, welcome, mourn, or rest. The gesture may be simple, but repetition gives it weight. A greeting reduces uncertainty at the moment of approach. A shared meal turns eating into a social event. A funeral gives the living a sequence of actions when ordinary behavior no longer feels sufficient. An evening routine signals that activity is slowing and another kind of time is beginning. These patterns do not prove that modern customs descend unchanged from one prehistoric practice. Human traditions are repeatedly altered, borrowed, rejected, and reinvented. What survives is the broader capacity to create order through familiar action. At the beginning of human community, repeated behavior helped people recognize expectations without needing every rule to be explained again. A visitor knew where to pause. A family knew when food would be divided. A group knew how to respond when someone died or returned after absence. Shared sequence reduced the number of decisions required during emotionally or practically difficult moments. It did not remove disagreement, but it created a framework within which people could act together. This function remains visible today. A person entering a workplace, home, place of worship, or public ceremony reads posture, timing, clothing, silence, and movement to understand what is expected. Much of this learning happens by observation. Children watch adults offer thanks, lower their voices, wait their turn, or prepare a table. They learn not only the action, but when it becomes appropriate. In this way, ritual remains a form of social memory carried through bodies. It can survive without a written explanation because people recognize the sequence and reproduce it. Small rituals also preserve relationships. Remembering an anniversary, visiting a grave, serving a familiar dish, or repeating a family phrase can connect living people to absences that cannot be repaired. The practice does not restore the past. It gives memory a place in the present. This is one reason rituals often become more important during disruption. When homes are lost, communities move, or institutions weaken, familiar actions can travel. A meal prepared in a new place may provide continuity. A greeting shared in another language may still establish respect. A bedtime routine may give a child predictability when the surrounding world has changed. These acts are limited, and they cannot replace food, shelter, medicine, or safety. Their value lies in helping people organize attention and relationship, while practical recovery continues. Ritual can also become rigid. Repetition may preserve inequality, exclude outsiders, or demand conformity long after its original purpose has faded. Some customs survive because they serve those with power, while others disappear because later generations no longer accept them. Durability is not evidence of goodness. The deeper inheritance is the human ability to examine a repeated practice, keep what supports connection, and change what causes harm. Across historical resets, exact ceremonies have often vanished, but patterned behavior has returned in new forms. People continue to mark beginnings and endings, divide ordinary days from special ones, and create moments in which shared attention becomes possible. The environment may change, but a familiar sequence can still tell the body where to pause, whom to notice, and how to proceed with others nearby. Beneath a birthday candle, a respectful silence, a family meal, or the quiet sequence before sleep lies an ancient solution to uncertainty. When the world changes, humans repeat certain actions so that time, memory, and belonging do not become entirely formless. Memory does not exist only inside one mind. Human communities have always stored knowledge across people, places, objects, routines, and relationships. A path remembers through the feet that follow it. A tool remembers through the hands that know how to use it. A house remembers through the arrangement of doors, hearth, storage, and sleeping space. A field remembers through the timing of planting and the boundaries maintained across seasons. None of these things thinks, yet each can carry information by guiding behavior. This is why collective memory can survive even when no single person understands the whole system. One person knows the route to water, another remembers which seed was saved, another knows how to repair a roof, another keeps the names of relatives and obligations. Together, they hold a larger memory than any individual could preserve alone. At the beginning of human continuity, knowledge was already distributed in this way. Survival depended on many partial understandings overlapping closely enough to support the group. A child did not need to learn every task immediately, because adults held different skills. An older person could remember events that younger people had never seen. A familiar location reduced the need for explanation because its shape and repeated use already taught where certain actions belonged. Memory was therefore carried not only by words, but by the structure of daily life. Archaeology reveals fragments of this distributed memory. A repeated footpath suggests movement. Grinding stones indicate recurring food preparation. Storage pits show planning beyond the present day. Rebuilt walls reveal that people returned to places and recognized older arrangements. Yet the surviving object is only one element of the system. Its meaning depended on people who knew when, where, and why to use it. A vessel without knowledge of contents is only a container. A route without remembered destinations is only a line through land. The living network joined object, place, body, and instruction. This network could be strong because loss in one location did not always erase knowledge everywhere. If one household forgot a technique, another might preserve it. If one person died, several learners might retain parts of the method. But distributed memory could also be fragile. When populations declined, specialists disappeared, landscapes changed, or communities were scattered, the connections between fragments could break. People might retain a tool without knowing how to reproduce it, or remember a story after the place connected to it was lost. The origins of social forgetting often lie not in the disappearance of every fragment, but in the loss of relationships that made those fragments meaningful together. Civilizations expanded distributed memory through archives, roads, schools, offices, maps, and written records. Modern systems extend it further through libraries, databases, machines, and digital networks. No individual understands the entire structure supporting water, transport, medicine, food, or communication. People rely on other people, establish procedures, and material systems that remember on their behalf. When those systems fail, forgotten dependencies become visible. A simple action may prove impossible because the necessary knowledge was stored elsewhere in the network. Yet local memory can still remain in habits, tools, familiar places, and people who know how to continue basic work. What survived repeated resets was often not a complete record, but enough connected fragments to keep life moving. A route remained useful because someone still walked it. A recipe survived because someone still prepared it. A boundary endured because neighbors still recognized it. Memory stayed alive through use. Once separated from action, it became easier to lose. This remains true in the present, where ordinary life depends on invisible chains of remembered work. Each person carries only a portion, yet cooperation joins those portions into systems that feel stable until one connection is removed. Across human history, continuity has depended on keeping knowledge distributed but connected, allowing many small acts of remembering to support a world no single mind could ever hold alone. A society can forget who discovered a method while continuing to use that method for generations. The name of the maker disappears, the original explanation fades, and the place where the technique began may be abandoned, yet the action remains because people need its result. Bread can be prepared without anyone remembering who first ground grain into flour. A basket can be woven without a record of the first person who crossed fibers into a container. A path can remain useful after the travelers who opened it are forgotten. In each case, memory survives through repetition rather than biography. The method belongs less to one individual than to the chain of people who continue performing it. Near the origins of human culture, this form of preservation was essential. Knowledge was valuable only when it could move beyond the life of the person who first held it. A useful discovery that remained private ended with its maker. A technique shown, copied, corrected, and repeated became something larger than personal memory. Over time, communities could preserve the action while losing the circumstances surrounding its birth. The reason a plant was soaked might be forgotten, yet soaking continued because the prepared food was familiar. The origin of a knot might vanish, yet the sequence of crossing and tightening remained because it held reliably. Such continuity does not require people to understand every cause. It requires enough experience to recognize that one procedure produces a useful result. This can protect knowledge, but it can also narrow it. When only the action remains, people may no longer know which steps are essential and which arose from older conditions. A custom can continue after its practical purpose changes. A method may be repeated in an environment where it no longer works well. Without explanation, adaptation becomes harder because learners know what to do but not why it works. Even so, practice offers its own form of testing. Materials resist, food changes, structures fail, and results can be compared. People adjust through observation, sometimes restoring understanding without recovering the original history. Archaeology often encounters the final products of such anonymous knowledge. Pottery styles, building methods, tools, field systems, and food remains reveal repeated techniques, but rarely identify the first inventor. Innovation usually appears as gradual variation rather than a single dramatic moment. One maker alters a rim, another changes the mixture of clay, and another modifies the firing process. Later users inherit the improved form without knowing which hands contributed each change. The origins of technology are therefore often collective, layered, and impossible to assign to one name. Civilizations celebrate famous builders, rulers, and inventors, but most continuity has always depended on unnamed people performing ordinary work. When archives disappear, those famous names may vanish first from living memory, while the practical effects of countless anonymous decisions remain. A village may continue using terraces after the authority that organized them is gone. Families may preserve a preparation method after the language in which it was first taught has changed. Craftspeople may reproduce a shape whose symbolic meaning has faded because the form still functions. Across historical disruption, society often keeps the method because daily need renews it. What is practiced becomes familiar, and what is familiar is easier to teach. The process is never perfect. Skills can be simplified, altered, or lost when too few people remain, when materials disappear, or when new conditions make old work impossible. Yet names are more fragile than actions. A name must be deliberately remembered. An action can return every morning because food, shelter, clothing, movement, and repair still demand it. What survived repeated resets was often not a clear account of invention, but a living procedure carried in hands, routines, and expectations. Human history is filled with knowledge whose authors are gone, while their solutions continue quietly inside acts so ordinary that no one thinks to ask who began them. What survives through time rarely survives without change. A method carried from one generation to another is adjusted by new materials, different climates, changing populations, and altered needs. This does not mean the tradition has failed. Adaptation may be the reason it continues at all. A building technique developed in a dry region may require a different roof when people move into heavier rain. A food once prepared with one grain may be made with another after migration or crop failure. A familiar tool may take a new form when stone, wood, metal, or fiber becomes scarce. The practical relationship remains, while its visible expression changes. Near the origins of human culture, survival depended on this flexibility. Knowledge could not remain useful merely because it was old. It had to answer the conditions in which people actually lived. A route remembered across generations might become unsafe after a river shifted. A seasonal signal might lose reliability as weather patterns changed. A plant used in one landscape might be absent in another. Communities therefore preserved knowledge not only by repeating it, but by testing it against experience. People noticed when inherited expectations no longer matched the world. They altered timing, materials, movement, or division of labor. Some changes were deliberate, while others accumulated slowly through countless small choices. The result could look different enough that later generations no longer recognized its earlier form. Archaeology often records this process through gradual changes in pottery, houses, tools, food remains, and settlement. These changes do not always indicate that one population completely replaced another. They may show local people adjusting to new contacts, pressures, resources, or preferences. At other times, migration brought different traditions together, producing combinations that belonged fully to neither earlier group. Memory became layered. One method was retained, another abandoned, and a third altered until it fit new circumstances. This is why cultural continuity should not be confused with purity. No living tradition remains sealed from contact or time. Even practices described as ancient have passed through many hands, each working within a different present. Population structure also shapes what can survive. A large community may support specialists whose knowledge requires years of training. When numbers decline or people scatter, such skills can disappear because too few learners remain. Simpler practices may continue because many people use them. Yet a smaller community may also innovate quickly when familiar supplies fail. Necessity can force knowledge into new forms. The origins of human resilience also lie in this capacity to preserve function while releasing form. A container need not remain woven if clay becomes available. A shelter need not copy an older design if wind, rain, or temperature demand another. A story may change its setting while continuing to teach a warning about behavior or place. Each alteration risks losing something, but strict repetition also carries risk when conditions no longer match the inherited method. Across political collapse, migration, environmental change, and contact between communities, knowledge survived through a balance between memory and revision. Too little memory forced people to rediscover what had already been learned. Too little revision trapped them inside solutions designed for another world. Human continuity emerged between these extremes. What crossed repeated resets was not a frozen package delivered intact from the distant past. It was a living process in which people remembered enough to begin, observed enough to notice failure, and changed enough to continue. Every generation becomes both receiver and editor, keeping portions that remain useful, overlooking others, and introducing choices shaped by circumstances no ancestor could have predicted. Continuity is created through this editing, even when people believe they are simply repeating what came before. The surviving inheritance is therefore difficult to isolate. It is present not only in what looks old, but in every altered practice that still answers an ancient human need. Memory endures by moving, and because it moves, it never arrives unchanged. What remains after repeated collapse is rarely the largest structure or the most celebrated invention. Towers fall, records decay, roads disappear beneath soil, and systems that once connected distant populations can become impossible to maintain. Yet human beings do not begin again from emptiness. They carry capacities older than cities and more portable than monuments. They can notice patterns, learn by watching, remember useful distinctions, cooperate under pressure, care for children, tend the injured, make tools, prepare food, manage heat, share warnings, and rebuild trust through repeated contact. None of these abilities guarantees survival, and none makes collapse harmless. They are simply the foundations from which social life can be formed again. At the beginning of humanity, these capacities were already working together. A body could move, but movement became safer when roots were remembered. A hand could shape material, but skill became durable when another person demonstrated the motion. A child could learn, but only if adults remained close enough to protect and teach. Fire could transform food, but only through attention, fuel, and shared practice. Language could carry experience, but only if listeners trusted the voice and preserved what mattered. These abilities were never isolated traits. They formed a network, with each one strengthening the others. Cooperation increased the value of memory. Memory improved the use of tools. Tools expanded access to food. Food supported children and the injured. Care preserved people who carried knowledge. Language connected all of these across time. This network helps explain why human continuity can outlast particular civilizations. A state may disappear while households remain. A workshop may close while trained hands continue working elsewhere. A written archive may be lost while a spoken method survives in daily use. A trade route may fail while local exchange continues among familiar people. A ritual center may fall into ruin while families preserve smaller practices of mourning, greeting, and remembrance. The surviving form is often reduced, altered, and incomplete, but it can still carry enough structure for life to continue. This does not mean that every society preserves the same inheritance. Skills disappear when materials vanish, populations scatter, or too few people remain to teach. Languages die, crops are lost, roots become forgotten, bodies suffer when sanitation, medicine, shelter, or food systems fail. Human adaptability has limits, and history contains many losses that were never repaired. The durable inheritance is therefore not a promise that civilization will always recover. It is a capacity for partial renewal under conditions that allow people to cooperate and learn. The origins of that renewal remain present in ordinary acts. Someone shows another person how to repair a tool. A family shares food during shortage. A traveler describes a safer path. A community modifies a shelter for a new climate. A child learns words that name relatives, places, dangers, and obligations. These moments appear small beside the scale of empires, yet they are the places where continuity is actually carried. Modern civilization depends on them more than its surfaces suggest. Electricity, hospitals, transport, agriculture, and digital networks require specialized knowledge, but they also require trust, teaching, care, attention, and coordination. Remove those human foundations, and machines alone cannot sustain a society. What survived every reset was not one secret object or hidden institution. It was a cluster of living abilities renewed in each generation and changed by every environment. Their strength came from being distributed across bodies and relationships rather than stored in one place. They survived because people used them while walking, cooking, repairing, warning, listening, grieving, and raising the young. No ruler designed this inheritance, and no single culture possessed it in a final form. The oldest inheritance still here now is therefore not a relic from a vanished world. It is the human capacity to turn shared vulnerability into learned cooperation, and to carry enough knowledge forward for life to remain organized after certainty has been lost. Modern civilization appears to rest on machines, electricity, medicine, transport, and digital information, yet none of these systems can function without older human abilities beneath them. A hospital depends on trained knowledge, but also on attention, trust, communication, and care. A power grid depends on engineering, but also on workers who coordinate, follow procedures, report danger, and teach replacements. A city depends on roads, water, food, sanitation, and law, but each system requires people to remember responsibilities and respond when something fails. Technology expands human reach, yet it does not remove the need for cooperation. It makes cooperation more complex and often less visible. A person turning on a light rarely sees the many lives connected to that moment, from those who maintain lines to those who manage fuel, equipment, records, and safety. The surface feels automatic because the human network beneath it is working well. At the beginning of humanity, cooperation occurred among smaller groups whose members often knew one another directly. Modern societies extend the same problem across millions of strangers. How can people coordinate when they cannot personally observe every action or judge every intention? Institutions provide rules, standards, records, and training, but those institutions still depend on people who believe their work matters and who expect others to perform their own roles. Trust is therefore not a soft addition to civilization. It is part of its infrastructure. When trust weakens, every transaction demands more checking, every warning may be doubted, and every shared system becomes harder to maintain. Teaching is equally fundamental. Scientific knowledge can be stored in books and databases, but storage alone does not create understanding. A learner needs guidance, practice, correction, and time. Skilled people must show others how to interpret information and act safely. If teaching stops, complex systems may continue briefly, then become increasingly fragile as experienced workers disappear. The origins of human continuity remain visible here. Knowledge survives because one person helps another cross the distance between not knowing and knowing. Care plays a similar role. Modern economies often treat caregiving as separate from production, yet no workforce exists unless children are raised, illness is managed, and vulnerable people receive support. Families, hospitals, schools, and communities all perform forms of care that allow knowledge and labor to continue across generations. Without them, machines may remain standing while the society capable of using them weakens. The same is true of language. Digital systems can transmit enormous quantities of information, but human beings must still explain, question, listen, and resolve misunderstanding. Data does not automatically become judgment. A warning must be recognized as important. A procedure must be interpreted in context. A mistake must be admitted before it can be corrected. These actions depend on social conditions as much as technical ones. Modern civilization, therefore, contains an ancient core inside every advanced layer. Beneath the laboratory is apprenticeship. Beneath the market is trust. Beneath the school is patient attention. Beneath public health is cooperation. Beneath every archive is a community that decides what should be preserved and who should learn it. This does not reduce modern achievement to something simple. It reveals how fragile complexity becomes when its human foundations are ignored. No society can be maintained by devices alone. People must remain capable of coordinating across difference, caring beyond immediate reward, and passing knowledge forward accurately enough for others to continue. During crisis, these quiet capacities become visible again, because damaged systems cannot recover unless people share reliable information, divide difficult work, protect those with fewer resources, and preserve enough confidence to act together before conditions become completely stable. What survived earlier disruptions is still required now, not as a replacement for technology, but as the condition that allows technology to remain useful. The most advanced civilization still depends on a person keeping a promise, another person teaching carefully, and someone else noticing that a vulnerable life cannot be left behind. The deepest lesson of repeated collapse is not that human beings are destined to rebuild the same world forever. History offers no guarantee of recovery, and resilience should never be used to make suffering seem small. Societies can lose languages, knowledge, populations, landscapes, and possibilities that never return. The value of studying survival lies elsewhere. It reminds us that civilization is not only what stands above people in the form of institutions, monuments, and machines. It is also what passes between people through care, trust, practice, memory, and attention. These quieter forms of inheritance are easy to overlook because they leave fewer ruins, yet they are the means through which every larger system is renewed. A child learns a language because someone speaks patiently. A worker masters a skill because someone demonstrates and corrects. A community preserves food because generations have tested methods against hunger, weather, and time. A stranger becomes a partner because enough trust is built for cooperation to begin. None of these actions is dramatic, but together they make organized life possible. At the beginning of humanity, survival did not depend on knowing the future. It depended on noticing the present closely enough to act, and on sharing enough knowledge that others did not have to begin alone. That ancient arrangement remains beneath the modern world. We inherit bodies capable of learning, but not the knowledge itself. We inherit social needs, but not a guaranteed community. We inherit the ability to speak, yet every language must still be taught. We inherit hands capable of making, but every technique must still pass through practice. What survives, therefore, is never automatic. It remains alive only while people use it, revise it, and give it to others. This is the educational value hidden inside the idea of a reset. The most durable parts of civilization are not necessarily the hardest materials or the most advanced devices. They are the relationships and habits that allow knowledge to move when structures fail. Protecting archives matters. Maintaining science, medicine, sanitation, agriculture, and infrastructure matters. But these achievements endure only when societies also protect teaching, trust, truthful communication, care for vulnerable people, and the patient transfer of skill. A culture that neglects those foundations may possess powerful technology while weakening its ability to carry that technology forward. The past does not instruct us to reject complexity or return to an imagined simpler age. Earlier life was often dangerous, uncertain, and physically demanding. The lesson is not that collapse would restore something pure. It is that progress remains dependent on capacities much older than progress itself. Every generation receives a world it did not build alone. It also receives responsibility for deciding what will be maintained, what will be changed, and what will be allowed to disappear. It asks us to see preservation as daily work rather than emergency preparation, keeping knowledge understandable, ensuring that more than one person can perform essential tasks, listening across generations, and maintaining bonds strong enough to carry truth and practical help through fear, scarcity, displacement, and change. We may call ourselves the seventh civilization, but the number is less important than the question it opens. Beneath our cities are older ways of learning. Beneath our markets are older forms of obligation. Beneath our machines are hands, memories, and shared attention. Beneath our confidence is the same vulnerable human need for others. What survived every reset was not one hidden empire, one perfect tradition, or one secret technology. It was the unfinished human capacity to begin again without beginning from nothing. That capacity is still here now, carried quietly in every act of teaching, repairing, remembering, feeding, warning, listening, and staying near another person when leaving would be easier. The final inheritance is not certainty, but responsibility. If the systems surrounding us vanished, which parts of our humanity would we have preserved well enough to carry into whatever came next?